Will Bowyer, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
You are a sports lawyer.
That
What on
is
earth
correct.
is a sports lawyer?
It's a good question. Well, there's no such thing really. It's all a big lie. It's actually just it's a combination of things really. I guess it's a combination of different areas of law that all apply to those working in the sports sector. Predominantly for me, it's commercial contracts law. So anything that requires an agreement between two parties, but with a sporting element to it. So you have the commercial contract side, but then you also have the IP side. You also have the regulatory side, which is probably the most kind of sports specific niche aspect to it. And then you also have disputes as well. So it's kind of those four areas bind, and like I say, applied to athletes, talent, agencies working with those athletes, or brands in association, or even rights holders, so teams, stadiums, all that sort of stuff. It's a kind of cross of those, and it means for me that I'm have to be across everything and not a specialist in either of those really.
So what would a typical example of the work that you do be?
So, I mean, that's the thing. Because of those four things, I mean, there's not really like a typical day, but I guess, for me, a lot of my focus is on individual athletes at a kind of young or junior kind of age. So a typical client would be a Premier League kind of academy player, or a young boxer who's just come out of the Olympics, or racing driver, someone like that who's kind of formulating their professional team around them. So they're needing an accountant, a lawyer, maybe a wealth advisor, some insurance, all that sort of stuff. And that's a nice time for us to kind of step in and start delivering some legal advice, really. So yeah, with a Premier League player who's kind of maybe just come out of the academy or moving on to their kind of first or second professional contract, that's where they would really need a lawyer, because they're signing away certain rights to the club. They're probably going to have an agent who's going to obviously want a contract with them as well. So that's when we can help. And if they get to a point where they become a brand in themselves, that's when we can really be of help. So for example, if you have that Premier League player who's now going to get a couple of shots in the first team, and they probably going to get a boot deal alongside that, things like that. That's the sort of time that will happen. They might go off and build themselves online. They might do influencer type work. There's lots of commercials around them, which means they probably also need something kind of image rights advice, which is kind of where we can come on into a bit more detail later, I guess. But it's kind of an area where there's a lot of tax advice around it, and we need to work alongside a tax advisor to make sure that the player's image, or whichever kind of talents, their image is protected properly. So yeah, it's kind of sorting out their commercial contracts and then thinking about their personal brand and how we can protect it, really. And at the other end of the scale, so we do a lot of work with teams, and like I said, agencies, and they're obviously usually more developed businesses, so they also have commercial contract requirements, but often they are basically taking all those points that you'd consider with an athlete and twisting them around. So you look from the agency's perspective and how you can protect the business. And kind of a thing that comes with that often is disputes. Naturally, if you've got businesses working together, lots of money floating around, assets in the form of talent, often things go wrong and people fall out, and there's kind of money that needs to be kind of found through dispute resolution or through going through the court process. So that's another kind of key area of our work as well.
You mentioned boot deals. What's in terms of the numbers, a typical boot deal for a Premier League football player?
That is a good question. It would depend completely on basically who the player is, which club they're at, and which brands they're going to work with. So, I mean, I've seen basically quite often it's just a boot-only deal. So if you're in an academy, you're going to get a boot-only deal, which works very nicely in my eyes for the brands, because they can attract talent in by giving them £200 boots every other month, which is a nice, easy fix for the brands. It gets them in front of the athletes, and often young players are completely happy with that, especially if you're 16, 17. Like, you don't necessarily have a commercial brand yet, so you're going to take really nice pairs of football boots just every other month, and then that can quite quickly step up. I mean, most recent one that we've done is for an Arsenal player, and that was a pretty hefty deal. It's about between 2 and 3 million across a 3-year term, and this is for a player who's not necessarily always in the starting 11, I guess. So it can be pretty good numbers. And then if you go right to the top end of the sport, you've got huge deals, which are multi-million deals, and there's often, depending on the brand, you can even get an equity play to it. So you've got smaller boot brands that might offer equity in the business, for example, if you're a name that can kind of negotiate that. But there's obviously the Nikes and the Adidases of the world that have been making boots forever, and they can, everyone knows who they are, and it's kind of fairly easy enough to get a boot deal. Certainly with Adidas, Nike a little bit harder, I would say, but fairly straightforward. But then what kind of the current theme that I've been seeing is obviously there's brands like New Balance that are coming into football, Skechers, Under Armour, and there's reports of some of the other kind of high-end sports brands bringing boots out as well in the near future. So if you're going to go and work with them, they won't dish out deals as much, but you can probably get yourself a better deal based on that. But you just need to be careful as to what you're actually signing away, what you're committing to. And that's a lot of what we do, is basically saying, right, here's what the talent's giving to the boot brand, here's what they can use their image for, but let's just protect you in the best way possible. So make sure you get paid, make sure they don't go and use your image in ways that you weren't, you're not happy with. And they're fairly straightforward. Other than that, it's a services agreement. You're agreeing as a player to deliver kind of sponsorship, ambassadorial type services to a brand in exchange for cash. But the most important bit is that there is a license there of intellectual property, and that's kind of the nuance bit. But that's the same with anything sponsorship related. It's usually a services contract with IP elements.
So 2 to 3 million across 3 years, and that's for someone who's not in the starting 11. If you span that over 20 players plus, that's a lot of boots that you have to sell off the back to make a really good ROI. How are these brands making all of that money and obviously more back?
I think it just comes down to the fact that, obviously we're focusing on football, but often these brands have bigger, wider offerings. It's not just football. So, someone like Nike and Adidas are just such Goliath businesses. They can quite easily recover that across all the different sports and lifestyle goods that they're making. I mean, and it can't be kind of overestimated that, football itself, the number of people watching it and engaging with it, certainly in this country, I don't know the figures, but the number of people sitting down to watch football week in, week out, play football, like I say, not everyone in the Arsenal team's got that deal. So it's a good deal for someone who's not consistently starting. But, quite quickly, I think that a brand like that can easily recover that sort of expenditure.
You mentioned that you work with a lot of young players, and especially as they progress. When it comes to the brand and then the individual players or the athletes, who holds the power? Is it that the brand wanting to get the athletes, or are the athletes just chomping at the bit to get a sponsorship with a big brand?
The answer is there's a threshold. So the academy players, like I say, the brands are in such a position they can just give them boots and they'll be happy. So the brand's in the driving seat there. But once you hit over a certain threshold, whatever that may be in terms of brand power, club power, and I guess lots of different factors create that threshold, whether it's, how good your agent is, how big your club is, how big, how many other deals you've got on the table, things like that. There's a threshold for when it flips, and then the actual athlete can really be choosy about who they work with. The good players and the good, not just in football, the good athletes that we work with have a good agent that works with them and can really take the time to work out how much their client is worth, and then go off and kind of source deals that align with that. Often, you can see it sometimes when it goes wrong, and you see players who, there's certain players in the Premier League now who, and I won't name names, who I think should be getting a lot better deals, certainly with their boot manufacturers, than they have got at the minute, because there's household names that don't have huge boot deals. Some players don't even have boot deals, and you'd be shocked that some England players don't even have boot deals, which there may be some wider strategy behind that they're waiting for a better deal, and that I don't know, I'm not privy to, but you see it all over. But I think the summary is there's threshold that it all flips, and once you become kind of a seasoned vet of the sport, you're in your prime, that's when you can really dictate who you're going to work with, because you've got income from various other opportunities, you've got investments, you've got commercial deals with brands that are nothing to do with your sport, so that's when it flips.
You mentioned agents there. Are they the point person for the athletes, and then from the agent they'll deal with you and whoever else is needed, or are you more involved?
Well, we try to be more involved. the more involved for us, the better, because the better your clients, then the better you can advise them on anything. Because a lot of the time we're not giving out legal advice, we're giving out just commercial consultancy based on experience. So the closer to the talent, the better in my eyes. However, you've got to be conscious that in this industry, a lot of the work that we get comes from agents. So then we're not just going to go and take that client and cut the agent out and stop communicating with them. And often, like I said at the start, I mean, our client base is often with the athlete, but it's also with the agency. So it's good because it means we can see it from both sides. So we know how we would act if if the agent was our client, and how we would act if the talent was our client. Just the thing for me though is, and often people don't get this, is that we are regulatory bound as solicitors globally, that if whoever your client is, it's them that you're looking out for, and it's them you have to act in your in their best interests. And often people think that if you're acting for a player, you can also act for the agent, which is for the most part kind of true, because they're aligned. They're in that boot deal example, or in that club contract example, or if it's motorsport, that seat deal or whatever, then they're aligned in terms of their objectives, because they want to get the most out of the deal, get paid, make sure they can go and do all those other things. But there's often situations where they're not aligned. And the most common one is the representation agreement between the two. So agent comes to a player and wants to sign them. We wouldn't be able to act for both sides. We would have to kind of choose who we're acting for. And for us, often, if it is that situation, then we would act usually for the agency, because from a business perspective, it means that we can then keep advising them on all their players. And then, if there's any kind of issues further down the line, it's their team that we'll be on, if that makes sense.
You mentioned in an Instagram post that your firm consulted on the Harry Kane off to Bayern Munich. Reading between the lines, then, can we confidently conclude that you were single-handedly responsible for that transfer?
Depends who you ask. I mean, don't tell that to all the Spurs fans that are in this office. But yeah, no, it was definitely not me at all single-handedly. It was a team effort, and it's a relationship, with various people that we've built over a long period of time, and it's very rare that we can talk about kind of client wins. But with that one, it was great that we were involved in all of the legals around it, basically, up to a point, and I guess it's worth mentioning, up to a point where we needed German kind of labour law advice. So we kind of, in a situation like that, we deal with all the English and kind of Welsh kind of elements. So sorting out his contract with Spurs, or whichever leaving club it is, sorting out everything with the image rights company here in the UK, and then obviously helping set up mirrored type setups over in Germany, and dealing with all those sort of bits, and working with those kind of German lawyers to facilitate that. Often, an important bit of our role is knowing, like kind of staying in our lane and knowing when to kind of pass over to other advisors and other jurisdictions, because we're not, kind of coming back to that best interest point, we're not regulated to advise in any other country other than here. So it's important that we kind of stick to that. But yeah, no, that was a really big deal for us, and it's nice that we can talk about it.
When a big contract like that comes across, does the whole firm, the department in the firm, does it pool its resources together, or is there always a certain amount of people who deal with that sort of thing?
For us, I mean, we're still a relatively small team. So, I mean, including consultants, there's 7 of us. So with that, all the kind of lawyers were on deck to sort it out. And there was a deadline for that deal, which was widely reported that, it was an on-off deal for the days leading up to when it actually happened, which is completely accurate. And then just prior to that, obviously, we needed to get it registered in time for the German Super Cup. So it was kind of a time pressure that meant it was all hands on deck, really. And like I say, I can't take credit for it. It's definitely a team project.
As a football fan, it must be pretty cool to be involved in something as big as that. Were you able to, see things obviously on the ground, and then the newspapers were pretty much speculating? So it must have been really cool to be on the inside and been like, ha 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 ha. Yeah,
well, it is. And that applies to everything. Like football is an interesting one, because there's so much chat around football, and there's so much rumor and gossip. 90% of it isn't true. But in that, like I say, in that situation, actually, a lot of it was spot on. It was kind of back and forth, and because in football you've got so many ears to kind of to the ground at clubs and at agencies, and even within kind of the player's immediate team, I guess any sort of transfer is it's quite easy to get leaked. Even just back office staff at a football club quite easily get wind of what's happening. So yeah, it's I really like it. I mean, it's an essential part of why I like my job. And like I think in other sports we do a lot of boxing, for example. Boxing is probably our second biggest sport, and that's just it's the other end of the spectrum, because you've got such a small industry in terms of British boxing and how it's controlled. Football is very it's very spread out. You've got hundreds and hundreds of agents, hundreds and hundreds of players, and then thousands of brands that want to be involved, and just loads of teams in a big system. Whereas boxing in the UK, you've only got hundreds of fighters, yes, but you've only got 3 promoters really that are at the top of the game. And you've only got 3 broadcasters that they're all exclusively signed to. So if you want to make it, then it's really tough, because you need to be aligned to one of those 3 promoters, which has pros and cons to it. But going back to your question, I enjoy that a lot, because it's you really do get to see under the bonnet of the boxing world and how that functions, and a lot goes on there. Like I say, opposite to football, where the papers never find out, and it's fascinating to hear how business is done behind the scenes, really.
If we talk about the Kane transfer, obviously you are doing a lot of the law side, and you're liaising with the German side on the law front. From someone who's not au fait with the football transfers, what else goes into something as big as that?
So obviously there's an agent involved as well, and this applies generally to any transfer, I guess. But you'll have 2 clubs dealing with each other. So there's contracts between the clubs, because they're selling an asset to one another. You've got representation agreements involved, so the player will have an agent, and then the agent might also have a role with the clubs, or one of the clubs, which is potentially changing with new regulations coming in. But they often sit in this almost double dipping type role, and there's various portals and processes that are required to actually get the transfer over the line, which is usually dealt with by the agent. So they're the ones that, alongside the clubs, they're the ones that a rep deal is lodged by the agent, and then the clubs actually process the transfer with FIFA. So we're not the ones hitting the button in terms of like a FIFA portal, for example, but we are the ones ensuring that those contracts have been properly executed. So legally, up to a point, from a contractual point of view, it's all binding. But there's still an obligation on the clubs to make sure they do their jobs as well. But there's lots of elements to it. But one weird nuance to it is that actually, in terms of negotiating a Premier League contract, if you've got a player coming over to the Premier League, they're all on standard Premier League contracts, employment contracts. So in terms of our ability to negotiate those, you can't change the terms of those. They're all agreed, and it's accept it or don't come kind of thing. What you can change is the schedule at the back, and that's the payment schedule. And so when you hear about agents negotiating employment contracts for their players, they're just negotiating one schedule at the back, which is how much they're going to get paid, what their bonuses are, all things like that, appearance bonuses, all of those. So that's where agents earn their keep, really.
What's a typical bonus then for, say, a football player? You talk about appearances and goals. What else would there be within that contract?
Well, it's funny. There's a Harry Redknapp quote, something about how it's ridiculous that players should get, certainly strikers should be getting goal bonuses, but you see like 5, 10, 15% based on
really
a goal or numbers of goals per game. But there's often qualifications for that. They have to play a certain number of minutes in order to get that triggered. If they play 1 minute less, and you hear stories about players being subbed off a minute before their trigger minute.
Really?
Because the club knows that if they pass over that certain hour, that hour mark, say, then now they've got to pay them a certain number of appearance bonuses, all that sort of stuff. But it completely there's a massive range, and again, I'm thinking from a Premier League perspective, but all the way down, there's still goal bonuses down in the National League, who also have a set contract, and in the EFL, who also have a set. So, like I say, it's where the agent earns their money. So sometimes they can be quite creative as to how they incorporate those bits into a deal. But yeah, I'm not sure clubs are always big fans of things like goal bonuses and things like that.
What would you say is the most important thing to put in a legal contract?
Oh, that is huge. The most important thing, I think, for me is something called an indemnity, which is, without going too much into it, basically an indemnity is the strongest form of legal promise that you could make against any obligation. So usually, for example, the way that we would do it is, and this kind of, I guess, the second most important thing is like I said before, getting paid. So say we're in receipt, whatever the deal is, we're going to get paid out of it. Making sure that there's a clear clause that actually says we are going to get paid on X date, which sounds obvious, but often is kind of is not dealt with properly and is kept vague and isn't as clear to both sides, and there's nuance to it. And then what you can do is back that up with an indemnity. So you can say, if that person doesn't pay, or if they breach any other obligation or material obligation in this agreement, then they agree to indemnify us pound for pound for everything that we lost as a result of that breach. So what that does is essentially it streamlines the process for recovering your losses if someone breaches it. So you would sue them under the contract, but you would focus on the fact that they gave you an indemnity against those obligations. So chucking in an indemnity is always a good win if you can get those in. And then there's also, there's lots of kind of smaller, almost like, we call them boilerplates, things you'd see at the back of a contract that people forget to put in, things like a jurisdiction clause. So people forget that you need to dictate where you're going to sue someone. If you write a contract, you need to make sure that you say it's going to be in England, because if they do business out in, I don't know, South America, there's an argument to say, well, you can sue me, but you've got to sue me in the Colombian courts, which is going to be far more expensive to anyone based in the UK, and things like that. Making sure that it's just very clear, if things go wrong, this is the process for it. So there's lots of, every clause is like kind of important, I guess, equally, depending on the facts.
If you're reading clause after clause after clause, how do you just stop your brain just turning into mush?
Maybe it's already turned. I don't know. I think I don't know. Weirdly, I enjoy the process of kind of when I enjoy the process of being sent a contract and then going through it and like forensically thinking through each eventuality with each clause. So that's the kind of engaging bit each time, I guess, which avoids you going to mush. Is you read the line, you think about how this could go wrong, and you have to engage yourself as to think, okay, right, if I just tweak this one wording, what am I opening the client up to by just changing this one word? So it's a constant process of reading it, changing it. How is it going to affect the client? And then coming to a decision on it. Like, I actually prefer that to just general drafting of letters where we're going, often a litigator is drafting a lot of formal legal letters where they have to be almost poetic in the way that they're drafting it and make sure that they set out their arguments neatly and cleanly and in a detail, they're not tripping themselves up kind of way. I guess when you're drafting a contract, it's like that, but you're on a much smaller scale. So one word in each line needs to mean something, and if you get it wrong, then there could be serious consequences. And I guess a point to note is that often the work that I'm doing is business to business, and certainly in this context, even if you've got a professional footballer or boxer, it's often considered a B2B contract. So under English law, if you're dealing with B2B contracts, you need to be very careful about absolutely every letter in the contract, whereas English law is very good at protecting consumers. So if you've got a consumer on the other end, there's kind of a bit of leniency that's given towards consumers. So it's kind of a court would think about what's reasonable and whether it was appropriate to put that in the contract with the consumer, whereas most of my world, like I say, is B2B, and so if you mess up, it's your fault. The courts won't be keen to step in and change a word for you.
You work a lot with footballers, but then also boxers and motorsport, as you mentioned. Is there a key difference or noticeable differences in their personalities just from the different sports?
I think, yeah, there definitely is. Just going through them, football, you have a lot of footballers who are surrounded by a lot of agents who, from the age of sort of 16, 17, even earlier, if you're an agent that doesn't abide by regulations, 15-year-olds even, and their family members are constantly kind of being surrounded by people that want something from them. And I think that creates an interesting character, for better or for worse. I mean, the result of that is, you have kind of players who are wary of everyone that speaks to them and everything, and it thinks that everyone's trying to sell them something. And combine that with a really high intensity, high performance environment, it creates kind of almost like a shy, kind of protective character, I guess. And that's why you see lots of dads and mothers and brothers getting involved and helping on the agency side. Boxing, on the other hand, is as kind of almost like you might imagine, there's lots of big characters, confident people, just on the fact that they know more than any other sport, combat sports I'm talking about generally, I guess, is that they have to be showmen, they have to be seen as ticket sellers. So everything that they do needs to be, with a view of thinking, oh, how can we sell more tickets? How can I get myself that promotional deal that puts me at the top, and gets me, once I've got that, gets me at the top of the roster each time, for each fight. And then you flip that round and you've got sports like cricket and rugby where there's nowhere near as much money generally. And so you see people thinking about what they're going to do after their first career as such, and they take a completely different approach to dealing with people like me, or building their networks while they're still playing and prepping and that sort of stuff. And because a lot of that is obviously money based, with football, once you're in kind of the Premier League, for a first team of a Premier League club, you're subject to injury, you're going to have a good financial future really, and that means you don't need to think about building a LinkedIn profile or networking or thinking about what you're going to do. Those things can wait a bit more. Whereas if you're a county cricketer, you need to start thinking about almost immediately after your career what you're going to do next, how you're going to protect your money, how you're going to protect your income for your family, things like that. So that creates a more kind of, I guess, more sensible, more focused person, I guess.
You touched on earlier about image rights, and before you mentioned it, it's not something that I'd ever come across. What do you mean when you say that you look after and protect people's image rights?
So it's often a term that I guess is misused. Its main use is in football. So when you've got a top player, traditionally, and clubs in my eyes are doing this less and less, but traditionally clubs will offer what's called an image rights contract next to your employment contract. So they would say, okay, a certain proportion, say 80% of your income that we've quoted to you as what we're going to pay you, is going to go into your personal name as a salary. We'll pay income tax and PAYE on it, and then we'll give you that other 20%. We're going to pay to your image rights company, and obviously then it's housed in your company, and a tax advisor would explain all the advantages of doing that and keeping it separate from personal income. Like I say, clubs are doing that less and less now, I see, and certain clubs don't do it at all. But the actual term itself just covers, it's basically a collection of all the rights that you have in your name, your image, your likeness, your signature, absolutely everything to do with you, which under English law is things that are naturally vesting. So you have image rights in Joe Riley, I have image rights in Will Bowyer. They sit with us personally and we own them in our personal right. Often people don't realize is that if you're, and this is basically HMRC's kind of approach to it really, if you're using a company for all your commercial activity, an image rights company with a football club being one, but most traditionally just any sponsorship deal, then basically the way that it's treated is that when you're using that company for those deals, those image rights need to sit in the company and not with you personally. And so if you don't do that, you don't transfer those rights across, and that's kind of where we step in. If you don't transfer those rights across, then there can be all sorts of tax consequences for doing that. And so what we would do is work with an accountant, and subject to their advice, we would say, okay, fine, you want to put your image into your company and then use that for those deals. We'll prepare a license agreement, or we'll prepare an assignment, basically a legal transfer, so it now owns or has certain rights to the image. So it's now no longer in your personal name. Joe Riley no longer owns it. Joe Riley Limited owns it, and then they can go off and enter into all those deals. Because from a legal, so there's a tax side, but from a legal perspective, often in a sponsorship deal, or most sponsorship deals, you'll be giving a legal promise to say, I own the rights that I am giving to you, that you can then put on your marketing and your branding. And if you giving that promise and it's not actually in the company, you're already in breach of contract. So you could also be sued on that side as well. So you could get a big tax bill at the end of the day because they might treat it as income tax and not let it sit in the company. And then you might get sued by the brand as well for lying about actually having rights that you've given them, if that makes sense.
You must deal with a lot of big names. How do you kind of put a lid on your inner fanboy when it comes to dealing with these people?
I guess you kind of, to be honest, I think because it's not, it's not international Premier League footballers for every single deal that we do. It's not World Championship boxers for absolutely everything. And like I say, we do a lot of work with academies and a lot of work with the agents. So either you're one degree removed from the big name, it's offset by dealing with someone that no one's ever heard of, and it's kind of a different type of excitement, really. You're thinking, you kind of back a horse almost in a way. You're like, oh, this is interesting. We're working with this client. Hopefully they really make it, because that means more interesting work and more work for us, which is great. I think you just kind of become a little bit numb to it, really, which is good, because I've heard horror stories of advisors, not necessarily lawyers, but people around top talent, getting selfies at the end of meetings and begging for the shirts and things like that, which kind of doesn't help. I think if you're trying to win work, if you're asking for signatures and things like that at the end, doesn't look good. A lot of pretty much all the work that we get, 99% of the work that we get is through referrals. It's through existing clients referring us to other people. Footballers don't go on our website and search sports lawyer. There's none of that, because like I said before, they've got people around them to do that for them. So it's all about who you know, who you trust, and who you want to refer. So yeah, you need to be kind of make sure you don't fanboy around them, I guess. But often, often people forget that they're just normal human beings, and often quite young as well. So top athletes are often early mid 20s, so they're still quite relatively young. They're not, and their life might have been literally just in a boxing gym, and so that creates a certain personality that actually can often be a bit kind of immature. So you kind of feel like you're older, even though necessarily not. So yeah, a mixture of those things.
You must have some serious stories over the years, or even heard some stories about some, inside. You mentioned there people asking for selfies. Obviously, you can't say any names, but can you just let us into any more stories?
Well, I can give you a weird one. I mean, if anyone ever asks what's the weirdest kind of client interaction that we've had, I mean, we were instructed by a former Man City player, a very, very highly rated player, still plays in the Premier League now, and had all sorts of the wrong people around him. We were introduced by his bank, who are great, and they were certainly the right people to be around him. But all the other advisors around him, I would say, weren't great. He didn't have an agent; he had an advisor who, we struggled to see what the value of kind of his role was, and parking fines, drink driving, things like that in the background, all those things going on. And we basically had joined a call with what we were expected to be with the player, but it was just this advisor, and we were greeted by an almost fully naked football agent on the call, topless. There's 4 or 5 of us all in our suits ready to go to advise, and we've got this fully naked man just wandering around his house on his phone taking a selfie video. And so yeah, we no longer work with them, and it was a strange impression that he gave to his professional advisory team, let's say.
Well, why on earth was he naked? Did you just think that he was king of the hill?
I don't know. I don't know. I think it was I don't know, some weird display of his alpha nature. I don't know. It was a weird one, but it was us in our suits ready for a professional call, and this advisor who clearly couldn't care less and was just wandering around his nice flat naked, and yeah, a bit of an odd one.
Every time I go on your Instagram, you seem to be at a different event for a different sport, doing a different thing.
It's knackering.
What's the best trip that you've been on?
Good question. The best experience that I've had, not necessarily trip, but the best experience I think is playing at Wimbledon. That was pretty fun. So just through, not necessarily through an event or anything, but through some great contacts, was invited for a meeting to be introduced to someone another advisor in sport. And the offer was to meet there and play there. And so got to play on the practice courts at Wimbledon, which was just awesome as a tennis fan to experience, and rock up in my full whites, racket ready to go, and to stand kind of in centre court waiting, thinking, oh my gosh, I'm basically Federer right now. Just need a one-handed backhand and I'll be there. And it was just a bit surreal standing there. And then we went around and played on the practice court. So kind of money can't buy experience, I think. But no, we're fortunate we get to go to lots of good stuff. Like for me, I didn't grow up around boxing, and so going to watch the fights I find that amazing, especially when you've got skin in the game in terms of that's your client up there headlining, everyone's here to watch him either win or lose. I find that a different experience because that's real sporting nerves, beyond what you'd experience watching football. It's really, really cool.
And just lastly, Will, you're currently an associate. Obviously, you will look to move up. What's the sort of career path for a young sports lawyer like yourself?
Kind of going back to the very first thing we said, because it's not a specific, it's an amalgamation of different areas of law. There's not a kind of clear path as there would be with a traditional sector. However, the legal profession is very good in terms of setting out its ladder. So you still need to obviously get a kind of qualifying law degree, however you do that, either doing law, converting, or kind of getting the right kind of course and doing that at university or law school. And then once you've done that, there's still a requirement for you to get a training contract. I think it's a while ago, obviously, since I've done it, but there is still a system where you can basically get qualifying kind of training contract experience instead of a traditional training contract, which would normally be 2 years. So once you've qualified, though, that's the most important bit. You get yourself as a practicing solicitor. And then beyond that, it's a case of, it's rare that you go straight into a sports role, I would say. I think the best thing to do is to get a load of experience in a commercial team or an IP team, or ideally, obviously, a sports team. But if your firm doesn't necessarily offer a sports specific seat when you're training, then it's a case of making sure you get some commercial and making sure you get some IP and maybe some litigation as well. Kind of joining those together, and then once you've got some more experience under your belt, then have a look at the top. There's a lot of amazing sports teams within London and Manchester and Birmingham that sit within larger firms like we have here, or there's also sports boutique firms that just focus on sports entertainment and IP kind of stuff. So it is out there, and then after that, like again, referring to me, it's the case of then you're on the ladder. So traditionally it would be associate, senior associate, salaried, and then equity partner, and then that's kind of the rung. So in the legal profession, it's good because everyone knows those sort of those steps, and then they're fairly condensed, so you don't have to, you can quite quickly get to the top, which is great.
And then if someone wanted to check you out online, where would be the best place to find you?
The best place to find us would be on our website, which is Lawrence Stevens' website. If you put Will Bowyer into Google, you'll find me there, or connect with me on LinkedIn.
And I would not recommend the @SportsLawWill on Instagram, because every time you go on it, Will's somewhere else. Someone else having a conversation with someone else, just across the great stage.
It's top quality content, I would say.
Amazing. Well, thanks very much for coming on the show.
Thanks, Joe.